동아시아의 대도시들, 우리가 살고 있는 서울이라든지 아니면 도쿄 또는 싱가포르 같은 데 살던 사람들이 서구의 대도시들, 파리나 뉴욕 같은 데 가면은 경악을 하는 경우가 많습니다. 우리들이 익숙한 도시 환경에 비해서 상당히 지저분하거나 아니면 치안이 안 좋다고 느끼는 경우가 꽤 많은 거죠. 그에 비해서 싱가포르나 서울이나 도쿄같이 질서정연하고 깨끗한 도시의 분위기가 너무 답답하다고 느끼는 사람도 있습니다. 그런 사람들 같은 경우에는 뉴욕이나 파리에 가면은 그 자유분방함, 남의 눈치를 보지 않고 사람들이 자기 스스로를 자연스럽게 표현하는 그런 모습, 또는 길거리에서 사람들이 모르는 사람과도 쉽게 대화를 나누고 포옹까지 나누는 모습을 보고 참 부럽다라고 생각하는 경우도 있어요. 그럼 이 두 가지를 다 가질 수는 없을까? 서울이나 싱가포르처럼 안전하고 깨끗한 공동체이면서 또 뉴욕이나 파리처럼 다양한 사람들이 모여 살면서 창의력을 폭발시킬 수 있는 그런 사회를 만들 수 있을까라고 꿈을 꾸죠. 이 선악의 기원이라는 책에서 예일대 교수 폴 블룸은 이런 사회를 만드는 것은 불가능하다라고 얘기를 합니다. 도덕이라는 것은 항상 트레이드 오프, 한 가지를 얻으면 한 가지를 잃는 선택의 연속이기 때문에 그렇다고 얘기를 해요. 예를 들어서 위생을 중요시하는 사람들은 남을 평가하는 도덕적 잣대가 훨씬 더 엄격하다. 나쁜 말로 하면 꽉 막혀 있을 가능성이 높다는 거죠. 뉴욕이나 파리처럼 다양한 사람들을 포용할 수 있는 사회는 도덕적 잣대가 낮기 때문에 포용이 가능하지만 대체로 위생이나 안전에 대한 잣대도 낮기 때문에 자유로운 도시일수록 치안이나 위생에 문제가 생기는 경우가 많다고 해요. 사람은 누구나 더 좋은 도덕적 선택을 하고 싶어 하지만 이 선악의 기원이라는 책은 도덕은 항상 양가적인 측면이 있다. 하나를 추구하면 하나를 잃게 되고 선택의 연속이다라는 이야기를 합니다. 이런 것들을 증명하기 위해서 폴 블룸 교수는 아주 어린 아이들의 눈의 움직임이라든지 아니면 어른들을 대하는 태도, 서로에게 캔디라든지 장난감 같은 걸 어떻게 나눠주고 분배하는지 이런 여러 가지 실험을 통해서 인간의 본성 속에 있는 양면성을 탐구하고 우리가 더 좋은 사람으로 살아갈 수 있는 방법에 대해서 책을 썼고요. 폴 블룸 교수와 줌 인터뷰를 통해서 인간의 선과 악에 대한 이야기를 나눠볼까 합니다.
When sociologists and anthropologists and psychologists compare countries and compare cities, they compare them on different dimensions. And one is a dimension which is sort of maybe tight versus loose, where Seoul and Tokyo and Shanghai, very tight, clean, people are polite, people keep a distance. New York, San Francisco, even Toronto a little bit, where I live now, a little bit more loose and more spontaneous and so on. I think speak to different aspects of our morality. So the tight cities, I think, tend to be safer, cleaner, tend to speak to issues involving conformity and in some ways, real moral ideals we should cherish. But there's something lost. And in a city like, New York or something, other moral values like spontaneity, often a form of generosity and kindness and openness that you don't find in a place like Seoul. And I think it speaks to a really interesting issue in morality, which is there's inevitably going to be trade-offs. So there's no solution. There's no optimal. There's no, let's you and I get together and find a perfect city that maximizes everything. We always live in a world of trade-offs. Mm-hmm. And I think this is one of the lessons of moral psychology and moral philosophy, which is there's no single path to the good. There's always trade-offs.
It reminded me when I was reading your book of a passage I read in a book by a historian named Michael Pye about the history of Northern Europe and why Puritanism or Protestantism evolved there. One of the hypotheses that he proposes is that because so many of especially the Dutch, were dairy farmers, and they were exporting enormous amount of butter to Germany and to the UK, and because butter is something that spoils very easily, and because this was a sort of a homegrown industry where every farmer was making butter for export in their own home, they had this idea of tidiness and cleanliness built into their culture over several hundred years of exporting butter. And when these people moved to cities like Amsterdam or cities like Hague, they were more open to the idea of moral purity as well because they were inculcated the idea of cleanliness from working in a household where they were making butter for export. Do you think there's any foundation to this kind of a historical hypothesis?
I gotta say this, you have hit an area, Dutch history, where I am totally ignorant. One story, just a very different story, is that cultures of honor, cultures where a reputation for violence is very important, for toughness, tend to be located in places where resources are easily taken and you're vulnerable. So if I'm a herder and I have cattle and you could just take my cattle, it behooves me to be very tough. So you don't do it. Well, if my resources are more stable, I don't need to have that reputation. The Dutch case is interesting. Again, it captures this idea that psychologists have that there's a psychological connection between physical purity, like keeping your butter clean, and moral purity, being chaste and not sexual, being polite, being distant, being not doing wrong, that there's a connection between the two. There's a psychology study. It's very controversial. I'll tell you what it is, but I want to sort of warn you that there's a lot of debate over how powerful this effect is, but it connects to your Dutch story in a nice way, which is I get you to think about something you did wrong in the past that you feel guilty about. And once I do this, I then give you cleaning products. And it turns out that you value cleaning products more. And in some research, you're more likely to wash your hands. So moral dirt can be fixed by physical cleaning. And the psychological research to explore this has, as I said, been controversial. Many psychologists think there's a deep relationship to sort of moral purity, cleanliness, defilement, dirt, and physical cleanliness, defilement, and dirt. So I don't know if the Dutch story is true at all, but it's not crazy.
And there's certainly a linguistic connection. I mean,
yes, that's right.
When people describe somebody who's corrupt, they're going to say it's dirty money, for example.
Yes.
Or somebody who's sexually promiscuous are often labeled as somebody filthy or somebody dirty.
Yeah.
Purely from the language perspective, we can see that people use the same word of physical cleanliness to describe somebody who's morally loose as well.
So it would really support that theory. And I think it's true, but you could tell me better. I know this is true for English. Is it true for other languages? Is it true for Korean?
Yeah, I think it's even more true for Korean.
Really? So I could describe somebody as a clean, upstanding person. And by clean, I don't mean they wash, they take a lot of showers. I mean that they're good. I say it's dirty business. He's a filthy person. Yes, there is that connection. If it turns out to be true across all the world's human languages, it's not going to be an accident. And it supports the theory that there's a psychological connection between the two. So I raise this in the context of a discussion of the emotion of disgust and the evolution of disgust, which a lot of psychologists and philosophers have studied. And I think the best theory of disgust is that it evolved as a way for us to avoid things that are biologically unsafe. So we're disgusted by body waste. We're disgusted by blood, by rotten meat. Things that go bad give us a disgust reaction. It is, I think, psychologically connected to morality. So if you're disgusted by somebody, you may think that they're less moral, and you get that connection. It's that connection I'm arguing against. I agree it's natural. Maybe it's universal, but it's something we should avoid. I'll just give you, one example is that many people are disgusted by sexual practices that they don't themselves enjoy. Something which is not erotic to you, that just, I don't want to see that. But to draw the conclusion, so it's wrong, we should punish these people, I think is just a mistake. I think we should focus our morality on things like, are people harmed? Are people's boundaries respected? Are people's dignity respected? And this gut feeling we have is very unreliable. For instance, many years ago, but not so long ago, most Americans were against interracial marriage between Black people and white people in particular, and also interracial sex. It was illegal in many places in the States. And the justification was, it's disgusting, it's wrong, it just grosses me out. And now we could look and we could say, maybe it grosses you out, but we shouldn't care. That's not a good reason. Does that make sense?
Also, in a lot of social discrimination, when the British aristocrats used to call the poor people the great unwashed mass, or in ancient literature, they always talk about people who are not signified as filthy barbarians or something like that.
Yes.
And also, in a lot of the online hate groups in Korea and Japan, it shows up specifically in those two countries where you take something that somebody does and you add a prefix meaning bug. Yeah. And then you create an insult where you designate a whole group of people as people who are contaminating the society.
Those are great examples. When we wish to ostracize or defile or hurt some group, we often want to render them disgusting in the minds of other people. So, a lot of anti-Semitic, anti-Jewish propaganda says, "Oh, Jews are dirty. They don't bathe. They're like animals." And so that's what worries me about it. As psychologists, we could explain it. This is why these two things are very connected in the mind, maybe for evolutionary reasons. But then, as reflective people, we can say, but it shouldn't matter. We should try to avoid that temptation.
I remember an episode from Black Mirror where the soldiers are wearing very advanced contact lenses that what they're doing is actually they're killing certain people who don't have immunity to a certain virus. But if they look through this contact lens, they see like a big cockroach or something. And that eases their moral sense so they can effectively carry out this genocide, order of genocide, without questioning the authorities. And that reminded me of what you said about the anti-Semitic literature, where, the Nazi propagandists would often draw Jews as like a big cockroach laying eggs everywhere and things like that. So I see where you're coming from. 사실 폴 블룸 교수는 여러 가지 영화들을 대상으로 한 실험을 통해서 인간이 원래부터 도덕적인 감정을 타고나느냐, 그러니까 우리가 본능적으로 도덕적인 존재냐, 아니면은 훈련을 통해서 도덕적인 존재로 자라나느냐를 알아보려고 했다고 합니다. 이건 우리한테도 굉장히 익숙한 소재 같아요. 왜냐하면 한국인들은 누구나 도덕 시간에 맹자의 성선설과 순자의 선악설을 대종하면서 논술도 써보고 학교에서 숙제도 하고 그랬죠. 저는 폴 블룸 교수가 현대적 과학을 통해서 이런 실험을 한 결과를 가지고 만약에 맹자의 성선설과 순자의 선악설에 대한 논술을 쓴다면 어떤 대답을 쓸까 궁금해서 한번 이 과제를 풀어봐 달라고 요청을 해봤습니다. The phrase that Mankius wrote that you quote in your book as well. Most Korean people have this sentence memorized by heart. Man naturally cannot bear to witness cruelty. A man about to see a child fall into a well feel fear and pity for the child. This is not because you are friends with the parent. This is not so that your friends from your literary circles shall praise you. This is not because you fear the bad reputation. What this shows is that he who has no pity is not human. He who doesn't hate evil is not human. He who doesn't yield is not human. He who doesn't distinguish right from wrong is not human. So this sentence is used in primary school papers as to show that Mankius believed that human beings were born with good heart, basically.
Yes.
And what does your research show? Does it track with your research that what Mankius said?
Yes. Yes, it does. It does. And in fact, Mencius's view was very much out of favor in psychology in the West, where everybody said, no, all of this is learned. The baby starts off as a blank slate. No morality at all. Freud said just an id, just appetites, just desires. And any concern for others, any sense of good and evil, right and wrong, is the product of the parents, is the product of society, is the product of culture. And that's not entirely wrong. A lot of morality is acquired through parents and culture. There's a lot that babies don't know about morality, obviously. But the core insight that you're citing seems to be true. You look at young babies, they will show pain at the suffering of others. So if they see somebody hurt, they may start crying themselves. They will, as soon as they're able to, show kind behavior, like they'll pat somebody who's in pain, or they might share or give a toy or give some food to somebody who seems without. In some research I've done with my colleagues at Yale, babies can tell right from wrong in very simple situations. So if they see somebody helping somebody else, they like that person more, they'll approach that person more. And if they see somebody hindering or harming somebody else, they avoid that person. So I think he's exactly right. The rudiments, the core of morality is there from the very start. It's evolved through natural selection, through evolution. We're a social species. And this is the foundation from which morality is built from. Professor Paul Bloom will be one of the most cited professors in primary school ethics papers. When I had to write this paper, I didn't have a reference to go to, but now they have this YouTube video and your book to go to. I recommend all the children watch this YouTube video and cite me, yes. And what's interesting in Korea is that usually the paper is not just about Mankius, it's about Mankius' philosophy, and it's contrast to another philosopher named Sun Tzu, who's big in East Asia. So Mankius is sort of considered champion of the born good philosophy. And Sun Tzu is considered the champion of the born bad philosophy, or born with nothing philosophy. For example, Sun Tzu says, a man is born bad. All good is an artifice. Human nature is to profit. Therefore, follow nature, fight ensues. Human nature is jealous. Therefore, follow nature, trust disappears and harm will ensue. Human nature is sensual. So if you follow nature, there can be no order nor good manners. Therefore, following human nature and feeling will necessarily lead to fight. Order collapses, heaven and earth is confused. So usually in school, these two sentences are given side by side, and you are supposed to write a paper defending either one point of view or the other point of view. And in your book, I found actually both points of view. Yes. So I'm sure a lot of people who are watching this video are wondering, if you were in that primary school's shoes and you had to write a paper about this, how would the great Professor Bloom write this primary school homework? So first I have to say, I'm not familiar with this other philosopher, and I have a sense that there's an intellectual philosophical tradition that people like me should study more because this is absolutely fascinating. And often when we frame these views, typically I would frame them in terms of philosophers like Thomas Hobbes, who says we're naturally selfish, or Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who says we're the noble savage. But these more ancient Asian philosophers seem to really say it better and say it smarter. So I have to revise my own education here. If I was in elementary school and I had to write an essay, I would say the best answer to the question, are people born good or evil, is yes. We are born both. So Mencius is right. We have these noble instincts. We care about others. We have a sense of fairness. We can tell right from wrong. But we also are shaped by evolution a sinful nature, selfish desires. We care about ourselves more than we care about other people typically. Often we're aggressive. When we get older, we have sexual desires, which are sometimes obliterate other moral things. I think any true account of human nature has to understand this duality within us. And I honestly think the best philosophers and the best religious scholars appreciate that there's a constant struggle within us. And alongside the sense of right and wrong, there are desires that erode trust, that erode kindness. A very simple example is if you ask somebody, I want to give you a moral problem, you tell me whether it's right or wrong, and it involves you. People, and this social psychology find this over and over again, are very biased to answer in a way that justifies their self-interest. One simple example is if I was to sue you and you had to hire a lawyer to defend yourself, but it turns out my accusation is baseless, should I end up paying for your lawyer? And people say, yes, that's only fair. I should pay for your lawyer. You shouldn't have to cost. But then you ask different people, you say, suppose you were to sue me, and then it turns out your accusation is baseless. Should you have to pay for my lawyer? People say, oh, no. And so, the same question just flipped in different ways. And you see both our moral sense. We feel, we have to do the right thing to do. But we also see our selfish nature.
There's a famous internet saying in Korea, if I do it, it's romance. If you do it, it's adultery.
Yes. There's a lot of sayings like that. What's interesting with these cases is we feel that we're doing the right thing. We feel I'm not a selfish guy. I'm just telling you the truth. But of course, we're influenced by our own desires and our own goals. The one qualifications I'll add is that if you just had rationality, intelligence, nothing else, no moral feelings, you wouldn't be a good person. You'd have no motivation to be a good person. You just do whatever you wanted to. In order to be a good person, you also have to have some degree of the sort of motivations that Mencius talked about. So I could be the smartest person in the world, but if a child is about to fall in the well, my intelligence doesn't say I should help the child. Who cares? My intelligence just lets me think about things. I also have to have this sense of compassion and care. So the reason why I subtitled my previous book, The Case for Rational Compassion, is I think both rationality, this intelligence, which I think we underestimate, is important, but compassion is important as well.
This reminds me of another famous debate in Eastern philosophy between the Confucians and the legalists, especially a philosopher named Han Feize. And Han Feize is known to have said that society where people are legalists are so just that if the father commits a crime, son will go to the police. And the Confucians said that society ruled by Confucianism will be so just that if a father commits a crime, the son will say, I did it.
That's a wonderful example. Yes, those are two extremes. And I think most people are somewhere in the middle where the son may not say I did it, but the son will not turn his father in.
And how are we born? The book is about babies. So when we are born, are those two instincts born together? Or as Professor Joe Henrik says in his book, is it natural to favor your own kin? And this universal responsibility and love towards society, does that only come through a very specific set of cultural norms and education?
I think the natural default for humans, because we are animals shaped by evolution, evolution favors animals that favor their biological kin, that favor those who they end up in reciprocal relationships with. The natural human default is to favor your kin, to favor those close to you. The idea that a good morality extends to everybody, the idea that somebody living in Seoul, who I don't know, matters just as much as my wife who's sitting upstairs. From the standpoint of an objective morality, she is no more valuable than a total stranger. That's a very strange, very powerful idea, but it's not natural. I think it goes to show that sometimes through our societal growth, moral progress, intellectual reflection. We come to have real moral insights that we're not built with. So just like the idea that we're living on a planet that is spinning through space around the sun, nobody's born knowing that. What a crazy idea. But we've come to believe it. Similarly, the idea that all people have equal moral weight is the same sort of thing. Not natural. We discovered it, and it's important. When it comes to adults across cultures, the studies actually don't tend to be done that much because they're so obvious. But when they're done, you find that, yes, people would rather help their child than help a stranger. People would rather help a friend than help a stranger. In fact, the very notion of friendship involves the sort of bias that we're talking about, right? Like, if I treat you exactly the same as I treat everybody else, in what sense are we friends?
I think that says it all. Yeah.
We know there's the foundational moral sense is there pretty much as babies. You won't even, as a baby, the child's just a baby. You don't even tell, but soon you'll see this emergence of kindness, of concern, of wanting to be a good person, of becoming embarrassed if they do something bad or guilty, and so on. And these will just emerge naturally over time. Often in the second year of life, you start to see a lot of this. The rest of the stuff that you're talking about, it isn't this sort of, this clicks in here, this clicks in here, this clicks in here, but rather culture gradually sets how kids think. I try to avoid giving parenting advice. I think psychologists are very quick to give it, and that there's not much evidence for a lot of the advice we give. But I'll say two things. One thing is, there's a lot of evidence suggesting that how your child turns out to be, you don't have as much control over it as you might think. Maybe in some ways, roughly half of how the child turns out to be is due to the genes. And that's what they got. The moment of conception is the biggest influence a mother or father has in their child. And then the second point is the rest of it. And the rest of it often has to do with culture and society. So cultures differ in all the ways we've been talking about. In one culture, the son will turn into father. In another culture, the son will take the punishment for the father. And that's a very important moral difference. In one culture, the adult may be very inclined to say, let's distribute things as evenly as possible. In another one, they might say, look, let's give the winner the most. You have all of these real differences between people. And I think the differences are largely set not by the parents, but by the society. Here's an analogy. You take a child born from Korean parents who moved to the States, and the parents speak English with a Korean accent. But the child's not going to speak English with a Korean accent. The child's going to speak English with an American accent. And what does that mean? Well, what that means is the child isn't learning language primarily from the parents, or I want to match the people of my age in my community. I think it's the same for morality. You and your wife may have a certain moral code, and you might try your best to inculcate it into the child, but inevitably the child's going to pick up the moral code from the people around him or her. And so, in fact, if a parent wants to influence their child's morality, one way to do it isn't so much to do it directly, but try to put the child into a group of people who shares a morality. So if, for instance, if you are religious, you might want to raise a kid in a religious community so that other children share the values you want your child to get.
I think that's why a lot of Korean parents, because they grew up in this highly intense competitive country where everybody's goal is to get into top universities. They try for a few years to have their kids not share those values, and they usually fail. And then what they do is they send their kids over to the US. And I think it worked back in my days because college competition in the US back then was significantly more loose than college competition in Korea.
And now we're like Korea.
Right. I definitely get what you're saying in terms of you don't really have control over how they grow up.
This is actually a big question regarding issues like social media. If you don't like the values of the society you're in, and you give an example, you might not like the values. There's other ways people might not like the values. Maybe they think the values of society are too materialistic or too atheistic or something. They just don't like them. It's very hard to say, okay, we're going to immerse you in that society, but we're going to tell you it's wrong. Kids are people, and they want to live in the world that they're going to be born into, not in their parents' world. So your best bet is ship your kid off somewhere where there's a value system that is more acceptable. But like you say, sometimes it backfires. And what happened was America became more like Korea. And now every 2-year-old is trying to get into Harvard and Yale. I'm very interested in a few things. And one of the things I'm interested in, what we were just talking about, is society's changes, differences between Korea and Canada and so on. But my fundamental interest is in human nature. What do we all share? I think the best way to learn about human nature is to study babies and young children, because this is at a point before they're powerfully influenced by language and by television, by the community and by religion and so on. And we see humanity in kind of its purest form by looking at babies. And I think it's a useful way. It's complicated, and in fact, even babies have different social and cultural forces pushing at them. But for the most part, I think it's the best way we have of looking at what all humans share. And that's the question I'm interested in. And what I found is very supportive of what we're talking about before, which is I found that, Freud says we're all born just as amoral animals. Rousseau says we're born perfectly good. I think the truth is more complicated. I think human nature is complicated, where we have multiple forces pushing us in different ways towards good and towards evil. Maybe the main finding is human nature is very interesting and not simple at all.
저는 오늘 인터뷰에서 가장 감명 깊었던 내용을 하나 뽑으려고 그러면 세계 최고의 신학자들, 윤리철학자들 아니면 사상가들은 인간은 양면을 가진 동물이고 그 양면 속에서 갈등한다는 것을 인정하는 것이다 라는 얘기 같아요. 사실 인터넷 사회가 되면서 우리는 도덕적 평가를 굉장히 쉽게 내립니다. 물론 옛날에도 그랬죠. 어떤 사람의 태도가 마음에 안 든다, 저 사람 예의가 없다, 아니면 저 사람 매너가 없다, 사회적인 배려가 없다, 이런 말들을 흔히 생각을 했어요. 하지만 그 시대에는 이게 나만의 생각으로 끝나거나 아니면 나와 내 친구들이 하는 뒷담화나 가십 정도로 끝났을 가능성이 굉장히 높죠. 하지만 오늘날은 내가 어떤 사람을 도덕적으로 평가를 했을 때 나와 비슷한 평가를 내리는 사람들 몇 명이 만나게 되면 그것이 여론이 되고 그 사람의 커리어라든지 심지어 사회 전체의 방향에도 큰 영향을 미치게 됩니다. 그런 세상에서 살고 있을수록 우리가 한 가지 선을 극대화하려고 그러면 인간적으로 다른 무엇인가를 잃게 된다. 결국 도덕은 타협과 밸런스의 문제다라는 얘기를 하는 책이 저한테도 깊은 영감을 줬고 우리에게 많은 도움이 될 거라고 생각해서 오늘 폴 블룸 교수의 선악의 기원 소개해봤습니다. 오늘 조승연의 탐구생활은 여기서 마치고요. 다음번엔 더 재밌는 문화 역사 이야기로 찾아뵙겠습니다. 안녕히 계십시오.